Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
We're excited to be digging into a passage that is challenging, certainly for me, here in episode 15, where we're looking at Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 24, talking about this Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman and Jesus' interaction. It begins there and says, Jesus left and went to the region near the town of Tyre, where he stayed in someone's home. He did not want people to know he was there, but they found out anyway. A woman whose daughter had an evil spirit in her heard where Jesus was, and at once she came and knelt down at his feet. The woman was Greek and had been born in the part of Syria known as Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to force the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said, "The children must first be fed. It isn't right to take away their food and feed it to dogs." The woman replied, "Lord, even puppies eat the crumbs that children drop from the table." Jesus answered, "That's true. You may go now. The demon has left your daughter." When the woman got back home, she found her child lying on the bed. The demon had gone.
So, Jason, what amazes you about this passage?
What amazes me about this interaction, number one, and this is more of the lower hanging fruit, but his power is so comprehensive. Like a lot of times when I hear about healings today, it's you got to do it in a certain way and you got to have a certain belief system, and there's no sense that this daughter believes it all. You know, that she has an inkling of faith or even knows who Jesus is.
I hadn't thought about that.
And he doesn't have to be there. He didn't have to touch her. There's no fanfare. It's just like bang, bang. I mean, when Jesus decides something is done, it's done. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't, even with supernatural things, we try to make it fit our rules.
Yeah.
And he's just like, yeah. And so that's amazing to me.
It is amazing. Especially, man, when you think about, we've talked about this in other episodes, like the timing of Jesus, when he heals, when he doesn't, how quickly he does, how quickly he doesn't, and just how quickly he alters the daughter's life and this mother's life. There's a sense from the passage that this is something that this mother has been trying to help her daughter with for a long time, for possibly years at this point. And it's always a good reminder for me when I see these things of how quickly Jesus can change things in an absolute instant. So for me, what amazes me is I was reading a popular theologian about this passage, and he made the statement that this is one of the first people, especially in the Gospel of Mark, to get a parable of Jesus. And we'll dive in a little bit deeper, I assume, into what we think, what Jesus is trying to say here and what this woman understands. But the woman fully gets what Jesus is trying to lay down here. And not only does she understand, but she responds in kind. Like, she goes into the cleverness, into the world of Jesus, and responds in his words, in his terms. So this is a brilliant woman. I think she's certainly smarter than most of the disciples, because she gets what Jesus is saying, and she also comes at it at the same exact level of Jesus, and that's just amazing.
That is, I think this is a complicated. Obviously, the challenge of this passage at face value is he calls a woman a dog.
Yeah.
So it's like, hey, I don't know when that was acceptable, but it doesn't seem right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is such an interesting thing, and it's a reoccurring theme that we find in the New Testament, that she is picking up on something. It's like the criminal on the cross.
Yeah.
Here's this person that hasn't spent every day with Jesus for the last 3 years, potentially never, had an interaction with him, and yet he is tracking with Jesus' purpose more than the people that are living with him all the time.
Yeah.
And you find a similar dynamic with this woman. I think if you think how many times the apostles are like, does he mean we should get bread? Does he, you know what I mean? They're so dull about things.
What I think is really interesting here, like you said, the criminal on the cross and this woman, they're all in out groups, right? Like they're all not a part of the system. They're all people that the system does reject and would reject. And I think it's really fascinating And I think it happens in our lives too. There are people who are outside of the group, right? Outside of who we would consider the okay ones, the saved ones, the good people. There are some of those sorts of people that get the things that Jesus is saying sometimes better than people who are in the group.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's interesting in other versions. I think, or in other Gospels, I believe Matthew talks about when Jesus responds to the woman, an added thing that he says to her is, "You have great faith." And what's interesting is, if you think about his interactions with the apostles, what's he usually say around their faith? "Oh, you have little faith."
Mm-hmm.
If you just had faith as big as a mustard seed. And yet he's acknowledging she has big faith. And the reason here is because she has more reason to be offended. She has more reason to be put off. She has more reason not to trust. And yet she will not be shut down.
Yeah.
She believes in him so much, she presses through. And I think that is just an amazing dynamic. And the takeaway from me is, I will often think, okay, now I'm going to learn spiritual things because I'm in a church building. Now I'm going to learn I'm going to learn things about God because I'm in a specific conversation. The disciple of Christ is always learning. Mm-hmm. God has taught me through movies, music videos, random conversations. I've seen commercials and I'm like, wait a minute, I've never thought about that, and immediately see God. The true disciple of Christ is always learning. And I think this touches on that dynamic of, we think it will go like this. Certainly we would think if you introduce the subject of call the person a dog, that's going to be the end of the conversation. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But he, again, is fine-tuning the conversation to where she lives, knowing that she will be able to, that it will resonate with her in a certain way.
So you mentioned something there, and I think it's really important that followers of Jesus, man, when we're truly living in the truth that Jesus is who he says he is, and that God created all of this around us, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, that we can see God in all of these different areas, in art and in culture. We can see it in so many different ways. For you, what does that look like? You mentioned like, I've heard a song, or I've seen a music video, and I've seen God in this context where I normally wouldn't see. Can you give any like examples of what that would look like?
Right. So let me see if I hit your
Sure.
question here. So this happens a lot in movies where I'll be watching. I remember years ago I was watching The Dead Poets Society, and in many ways that was kind of a darker movie, and you could say it's humanistic, the dynamic seizing the day and this kind of thing. But it inspired me. What I saw in Robin Williams, I was like, this is a guy that is courageous, and he's impacting people. And I realized I am not courageous. I always, when I say something, I want there to be validation from everybody, And yet he was so convicted that he kept seeing it through, to the cost of him losing his job. But he had impact, and it was messy impact. Like, I don't know, no spoilers here, but somebody kills himself in the show, you know what I mean? So it's a messy thing, but I thought, man, I see there's something in this character's portrayal that I lack. I lack that, and I have an even stronger message than just seize the day.
Yeah.
And I learned something about discipleship there, about don't be afraid if you're not immediately understood. Like when he's standing on that desk and saying, quoting this thing, no, everybody's like,
my captain.
Yeah, you're freaking out. But then at the end, when the students stand up, they catch it. See, because I was always convinced, if I say something and you don't get it immediately, I'm a bad teacher.
Yeah.
So God used that movie to teach me. Now, it doesn't supersede the Bible. I mean, a lot of times people say, well, if you're learning from Dead Poets Society, then you must not believe in the Bible. I'm like, no. God uses everything. And I mean, the irony of this is if you're listening to Jesus, you're like, why aren't you just quoting the Old Testament?
That's good.
Why are you telling all these parables?
Yeah.
There's so much opportunity for people to confuse these parables. And then Jesus is like, yeah, I tell them so people won't understand.
A lot of times I think people will see something like that. I'm like, well, that's just Jesus. And so that doesn't pertain to anything we have. And so, I just have to take these exact literal, these words, and they're the only thing that matter. And if that's the mindset, why do we even have preachers? Why do we have people even giving sermons? Because if all we need is this and no illustrations, no nothing, no art, no culture, then there'd be no need to listen to a sermon or to listen to a podcast.
Right. Well, and the irony is we're called to be like Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think what we say in our mind's eye, be like Jesus means be perfect,
Yeah.
never sin. And that's not, we're told we're going to sin.
So this is really interesting. I grew up reading The Lord of the Rings, and just recently I've kind of got back into diving into that world and reading about it and watching videos. And if you could look on YouTube, there's a vast, like massive culture of people creating different Lord of the Rings mythology videos explaining this, talking about this. What if this happens? What if that happens? Or what if Gandalf did this? Or what if Gandalf did that? And I mean, it's just, there's thousands upon thousands of videos with thousands of views. And it all comes from this world that this guy created 60-ish years ago. And for me, even 60 years now, 20 years past the movie, it's evoking these feelings in people who don't even necessarily believe in God, but yet see the trueness of the friendship of Sam and Frodo, or see the courage of Aragorn. Like they see all these things. And even for people who don't believe, underlying it, they respect, and there's something that draws them to these messages that are found throughout this book and through these movies. And that I was kind of hesitant to use that example because like J.R.R. Tolkien was a Christian and was using it not as a strict allegory, but he was using it in that sort of way. But you can find it, like you said, in secular projects in all sorts of areas.
Yeah, and see, here's why. If you really want to say, when the Ecclesiastes, when Solomon says God has placed eternity in every heart, that eternity is not a statement of time or absence of time. That word there means this idea of longing for something more, this deeper, this sense of there's something greater than this, you know? And so if I'm a writer and I don't believe in God, and I want to write a story that people will want to watch, and it will almost always have redemption in it. It will almost always have deep hope. It'll almost always have some crisis that seems insurmountable, and then some out-of-the-box answer, and then there'll be a resolution. I mean, there are obviously people, I think Tarantino likes to say, I will crush your hope.
Yeah.
You know, but in some ways, but vast majority of movies that or books that speak to us are these things. Well, the person that says there is no God was still created by God. Mm-hmm. He still has the same longings that God put in. And so an author will create, or a playwright will create, or a screenplay writer, I guess, will create a world of hope that they wish was. So they're tapping into that longing for God while denying God. Mm. And of course, they don't do it perfectly because they're not aligned with God. They're not thinking of the things of God.
But neither do we.
Well, that's true, too. We wouldn't do it perfectly either. And that's why you can find it in almost anything. You know, or let's say they write it. I remember there was a movie that came out and it ended like terribly. Like all the good things didn't happen, like purposely. Mm-hmm. It was a Tim Robbins movie. And it was like, man, he's doing this on purpose. Yeah. Like this is almost like What If the Devil Wins movie. You know, so even in that, you're like, oh, I see what he's doing there.
Yes, absolutely.
So lots of ways to learn. So let's get to the perplexing part of
things. So my perplexing is a little bit a different angle. We'll come back to the kind of main focus. But earlier in the first verse we read in verse 24, it says, Jesus left that place and went into the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know that he had entered a house, but he couldn't hide. I love I am amazed and love the image of Jesus trying to hide from people, but I'm also perplexed because you go back a little bit, if you read a little bit before that and maybe a chapter before that, there's this constant refrain that Jesus goes to the other side of the lake, or Jesus goes to do this, and then these people show up and he's got to feed him, or then people show up and he's got to heal him, and then this woman shows up and he's got to heal him. And it's both comforting to know that Jesus needed to rest, but it's also perplexing, the idea of Jesus trying to hide from people. Jesus trying to purposely stay away from people that need him. And that's just a really perplexing thought to me.
Yeah, and the idea of when he says he came to give himself as ransom, that doesn't mean he loses his humanity. Yeah. He has a need to pull back. And you and I, outside of this podcast, we're talking about Sabbath and the need to Sabbath. I think we feel this is a waste of time. I've got stuff to be productive in. Yeah. You know, and Jesus models at a cost even of momentum. Like he'll have momentum and say, now I'm going to separate myself from the group. And I'm like, well, that's not good strategy,
Yeah.
you know, and he's showing how important that is.
If you were going to lead a church plant,
Mhm.
you started off 3 months, it started rocketing. It's in this new area. You got all the best stuff. There's tons of people coming. People love your preaching. Like, okay, I'm gonna take a 2-month sabbatical now. I'll be right. I'll be back. Like that would be whoever funded you would be upset and angry. And I'm not necessarily saying that would be the Jesus way, that particular path, but it is that sort of. It does paint that sort of picture.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
I think for me, the thing that perplexes me is what we hit head on is this idea of him talking to her in a way that at face value seems extremely condescending.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like there is 1,000 ways to say this, and certainly you're the smartest man to ever walk the earth. You could think of it.
Yeah.
You've got to have a choose your own adventure list of responses you could give to her that could still make the point. Like he could have said easily, "Hey, I'm here for the Jews. That's who I'm here for, but I honor you."
Yeah.
He
could have.
And once I can consider that, there's 1,000 variants on how he could have responded. So to respond in a way that certainly in our ears seems very confrontive.
Oh, absolutely. And I think even more so in their ears, like for us, like a lot of people have like a pet dog. Like Jason, you have a pet dog, right?
Sadly.
Growing up, I had lots of pet dogs. So we some were okay, some were not. But for us, like, like my wife and I will sit on the couch scrolling funny dog videos and just funny pet videos.
Yeah.
That was not the case during this time 2,000 years ago in this particular region. Dogs were not seen necessarily as household pets. They were marauding gangs that would hunt, that would get in the trash, that would cause all sorts of problems.
Yes.
And so it's even worse than we think. Because if you go up to a woman, you call her like a dog, like you probably should get slapped. We're actually going to talk a little bit later about, maybe turning the other cheek. So I don't know what the significance there is, but like if I go up to a woman and I say, you're like, compare her to a dog, I should expect to maybe have some sort of repercussion. But if I go up to a woman and say, basically you're basically a marauding, feral, vicious animal.
Dangerous,
yeah. Like animal. Like I would like something even worse should happen. And I think that's the picture that I think we should all have in our minds when we think about this. Especially the particular group that this woman belongs to, there is a lot of animosity between this group and the Jewish people. And so there's just so much tension in this situation. And like you said, it is perplexing. The situation is very contentious between this Jew and this Gentile. Actually, the first thing that happens in this conversation is this woman initially humbles herself before this Jewish man, and Jesus ups the tension. And that is, I get why he does it, but it is perplexing. Why did it have to happen this way?
Okay, so just popped into my head. This is what Jesus wanted to happen with the rich young ruler. He wanted the rich young ruler to come to a point where he was like, I can't do this. That's offensive. I would know. And then not give up. And this woman, he's playing along stereotype. Like, he didn't create this idea of dogs. It was like I think you said earlier, this was common that Jews looked at Gentiles as the worst of the worst, because they had mixed, they had tasted the goodness of God, but then they distorted it, kind of thing. And so he's playing along that stereotype. And I think there's another thing he's trying to accomplish there, but he's playing along that stereotype, and he's testing her to say, who am I to you?
Yeah.
Am I a magician that if I offend you, you'll just walk away? Or is there something more about your belief? And like I go back to that idea, when he says you have great faith, I think he's looking for the opportunity, and I think he's looking for the same in us. He's looking for the opportunity for us to show great faith. But we can't show great faith if it's smooth.
Yeah.
In other words, for me to say, man, Christ Church is strong now. Christ Church is vibrant and it's growing in the middle of COVID, when all of the statistics are saying church attendance is dying off and churches will be shutting down. that's so much easier than if we're having the best time ever in our church,
Yeah.
and we're just growing.
There's a pattern, I think, that you find through the Gospels and even through the whole book of the Bible, that oftentimes humiliation precedes breakthrough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, it happens with Peter. It happens with this woman, where a lot of times, and I mean, this is always this is like legit a scary thing for me. Oftentimes for breakthrough with God, he has to take things down to the studs and has to reorient the group, the person, back to what he made them for. And I think that's what Jesus was after with the rich young ruler, and I think you're right. I think this is what he was after with this woman, and she accomplished it. She was successful. So the natural question here, we kind of talked a bit about it. We talked around it. Why do you think Jesus calls this woman a dog?
I think, like I said before, I think there's multiple reasons. I do think there's a big. If he'd said to her, "Hey, I usually don't do this because my mission is to the Jews, but I'm going to make an exception for you because I see you're a nice lady and you love your kid." You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Which is a way he could have handled
it. Basically tokenizing this woman.
He does. I mean, it's in many ways demeaning, but she misses the opportunity to show her faith in front of a rabbi, from her perspective, a rabbi, maybe not the Messiah, but somebody that's a true rabbi, and she believes has power from God, and to be affirmed. She misses the opportunity to be affirmed. And we cannot minimize that. How many times in your life was a well-placed affirmation a game changer for how you think about yourself? Mm-hmm. And for how you think about God and how you think about progression. So that's the first thing I think of, is he's setting this up for her betterment.
Yeah.
Again, back to the contrast to the rich young ruler. Had the rich young ruler said, "Man, I wouldn't even know how to do this. I'm in control of everything in my life, but to give everything away, I wouldn't know how to do that. Can you help me?" He would have experienced, you talk about humiliation, then he would experience, I believe, the one of the best experiences in his life. But he stopped prematurely and took it back on himself. Whereas she could have said, "Well, then I'm taking my ball and going home if you're going to be ugly." You know? So that's first. The second thing is the disciples are present. We learned that early in the chapter. The disciples are with him. Mm-hmm. The disciples are, many of them to varying degrees, they carry the nationalist racism. Yeah. And so for him to say something confrontive to her, with them hearing, and then her respond in great faith, and then him to acknowledge that faith.
Yeah.
That is a tremendous lesson for the disciples, because we cannot forget, when he calls them disciples, that means they are always in a learning mode, or he wants them to be, and he is certainly always in a teaching mode.
I think a lot of what Jesus is doing here is he's declaring to this woman, he's also declaring to his disciples and to us 2,000 years later that his kingdom, his will, his purpose is not just for the in-group, not just for the Jewish people. It's for everybody. And yet, like you said, the disciples are there. Peter sees this. This is basically Jesus declaring that he will be bringing his message. His message will go to the ends of the earth, like that this message is for the Gentile and the Jew. Like, this is basically what Jesus does here. And yet a lot of the disciples don't get it. And so for me, in my heart, like I see why Jesus does it, but like for me, I still long for that, like, man, if Jesus just could have been like turned around after he said it, and after he said this to the woman, and be like, "Okay, Peter, do you see why I'm doing this? Mm-hmm. Do you understand? In my kingdom, just because you're part of this in-group doesn't automatically mean that you're better than the person outside of the group."
That's right. And woman, property.
Yeah.
Non-Jew, they were born to fuel the fires of hell. So he couldn't have picked a better person to watch. And think about this. Think about how eggshell the apostles are at times. Who's the greatest? Yeah. Who's the greatest? And he insults her, and she doesn't push back negatively. She's not even like the woman at the well who said, "Well, I can see you're a prophet." Now, I'm putting intonation and inflection in her voice, but
sure.
She changed the subject. She's right there with him, like you said earlier. She's tracking with him, and she's like, "Yeah, but this." And he's like, "Man, you are a person of great faith."
Yeah.
And you have to know the apostles are thinking in the back of their mind, "Oh, last time we talked, he said, 'Oh, little faith.'"
Yes.
and he said,
funny.
"Great faith."
No, that's really good. And man, you have to imagine how intimidating this woman would be. So like you said, a woman, non-Jew, and she's clearly very smart.
Mm-hmm.
How just like you wonder what the reaction of the disciple, like, was it a dismissive? Was it like for many of us that are challenged by smarter people than us, or challenged by people who are outside of our group, was there a natural like, well, those people's things. That's that's for them. What I what I think there's a really another level to this woman's cleverness, and ultimately like credit to her humility is I was reading that oftentimes in this specific region, these Gentiles would be taking advantage of the local crops around the area. That they would be taking advantage of sometimes what Jewish people would produce. And so bread would have possibly been a kind of filler phrase for the grain, for the crops, for all these things, that this woman was, for a variety of reasons, we're pretty sure was probably more well off. She was probably financially a little bit better. The people in this area tended to be. And so she takes this thing that would have been a lightning rod, that there's this group of people that are outside the Jewish group that are taking advantage of Jewish people, and she takes it and she basically puts herself in the lower position. She takes herself and she reorients herself and acknowledges her lower status, and not lower status as a woman or lower status as in the image of God, but lower in status as basically any Christ follower should seek to be, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it's this idea you have this person that has no precedent modeling what a true disciple looks like.
That's good.
I will learn even if you call me a dog. I will stay in the game even if I feel insulted.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I deserve it. You know what's interesting to maximize this? This just occurred to me in Matthew 15 when he's telling the story. When Matthew's telling the story, it says suddenly a Canaanite woman from there came out shouting, "Lord, Lord and Son of David, have pity on me. My daughter's full of demons." Jesus did not say a word. So this is because, and then you attach that to the Mark passage. Mm-hmm. He's moving to privacy, but the woman kept following along and shouting. So the disciples came up and asked him to send her away. And so there's already this what we were thinking. This is probably how they were. Now we have confirmation that is how they were. They were very dismissive, which even further sets up. This reminds me of the blind man. That the blind was, "Hey, Lord, Lord Jesus, Son of David, come and heal me." And the crowd's like, "Shush, shush." And he's like, "Bring him to me." And they're like, "Hey, come on." You know what I mean? Like they are so wishy-washy. And the committed person in this story is who you'd usually see as the victim, or usually see as the weak one, the blind guy, this outsider woman.
No, I think that's beautiful. And it's something I think a lot of times when people talk about hearing from diverse sources or hearing from different perspectives, I think for a lot of people, and I can say this because it was me in the past, it comes off as some sort of token sort of thing of, oh, I'm going to do this because that's what I've heard is right, or that's what the in people are doing, that's what the cool people are doing. But I think for me over the past couple years, as I've begun to take in podcasts from there's a podcast I listen to by a rabbi where just every year he walks through the Torah and he just does it. He incredibly different perspective on the Torah that I've never heard in my entire life, and has really opened up some different things in my walk with God. One of the things that Jesus announces when he brings his kingdom is that all of the people that you thought were on the outside are actually on the inside. And I think in my own heart, there was a message that I was telling myself over and over and over again, was that, yeah, those people are in, like maybe they're saved or maybe they're cool or nice people, but they're not in like you are, Connor. And I think what Jesus does is he comes and he blows up this message that you're the in crowd and they're just kind of the in crowd. Mm-hmm. And when we can accept that, hey, these are the people that Jesus was talking to. The outside people, the people that aren't in our group, are the people that Jesus wants us to be talking to, wants us to be hearing from, wants us to be engaging with. Man, it opens up so much of a bigger world. It would get to, and I'm going to wrap up here in a second. It gets to like, this is always a struggle, and I don't want to insult anybody because like I'm not a parent yet, but it reminds me of when parents, like Christian parents, only let their kids consume, the Bible version of Star Wars or the Bible version of X, Y. I might take this out. The Bible version of whatever popular culture item is there, and only watches VeggieTales and only reads, the Bible pop-up books. I think when we limit ourselves and limit ourselves from very early on to a small group of people, it hurts others, but it's also a massive detriment to us and to our growth.
I would agree. I come from a heritage that oftentimes, if you're reading a book by a certain author, it makes you a suspect in your church circles.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember growing up with the terminology of, you eat the fish and spit out the bones, and that was supposed to be like really cutting edge, because prior to that, if you saw the book and you thought there might be bones in there, you weren't allowed to read it, which basically meant you could only read from Church of Christ authors.
Yeah.
That's my heritage. And then they would fight about who's the accepted Church of Christ author, and it became this really tense thing. It actually was a huge detriment to learning, because it's just like, well, what if I come up with a different conclusion than the status quo, and then I'm not with Jesus anymore, which is absolutely opposite of the Bible teaching. Anyway, the thing that this speaks to is how powerful is your God? How creative is your God? How inventive and innovative is your God? Because if I say you can only speak through this one way, then basically I'm saying you're not creative and you're not innovative and you're not always new, because you gave us the Bible and that's it. Now, I want to be clear. The Bible is the Word of God that helps us discern any other messaging we get.
Absolutely.
Because we get a lot of false messaging, But to go back and say, is this, number one, is this honoring the greatest command?
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, well, the greatest commands me to love truth. So is this true? It encouraged me to do all these other things that are spelled out in the Bible. How do we handle our anger? How do we handle our relationships? And so the Bible is critical in our walk with God.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply saying, if we have this almighty God that teaches all the time and he's the most creative being ever, then to say, but I only learn from book, chapter, and verse, it not only does it seem to limit it, but it's not the way you see in the Bible. Based on that, Jesus would only quote the Old Testament.
There's this sense for this woman that she has been trying to help her daughter for a long time. You have to imagine it. If she's willing to run up to a Jewish rabbi who she doesn't know, who is not a part of her culture, not a part of her group, you have to imagine she's taken this woman, her daughter, to different doctors, taking her to different healing men or women. You have to imagine she's trying to do every possible thing she can, get all the medicine that she possibly can, and yet her daughter is still possessed. Her daughter is still hurting and in pain. And I think there's a really interesting line here in my own life of pain. Pain is not a good thing. We don't worship pain. But I think a lot of times the beneficial part of pain can be that it can pull us in the direction of humility. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts that this woman gives us is she takes the pain of her daughter that could have made her angry against the creator of the world, and a lot of our minds, she'd go up to Jesus and demand, like, what did my daughter ever do to deserve this? Why is this happening to her? This is not fair. Like, if you serve Yahweh, then why is he allowing this to happen?
Yes. Why does a good God allow bad things to happen to kids?
Yes. Why? I mean, it's a legitimate question. Mm-hmm. And this woman allows this pain that for lots of people it corrupts and it drives you deeper. And she uses it as an escape line to humility and to accepting Jesus as somebody who has power, as somebody who has wisdom and who has strength. And I think that's the biggest encouragement for me. Are there areas of my life where things are particularly painful or maybe even humiliating, that Jesus is wanting to use those things to draw me into humility?
Yeah, as I step away from this, I think the lesson that is really resonating with me is that I have a certain expectation of how things will go, and I can't help it. It's just the nature of me being human and feeling like, oh, this will go like it went last time. and God is not interested in my predicting his, next steps. And he wants to develop a process in me that I am open to learning in however he's willing to teach. This is the fundamental flaw of the Pharisees and to some degree the apostles at times. And that he would use this scenario to really exemplify that is a huge gift to me. Now, it's threatening because I have a role and I have people that depend on me to kind of stay status quo. And that's an inner working for me, trying to figure out how can I be more like this woman versus the person on the side saying, yeah, you're a dog, or how offended I am that you said dog. And so that's what this really leaves with me, this idea of thinking, man, God is a patient teacher. Am I willing to learn?
Thank you so much for listening. Jason and I continue to be blessed by the process of recording these shows and hearing your reaction to them. In that vein, if you want to get a hold of us to share a thought, ask a question, or even suggest a passage for a future episode, you can do that through a variety of different ways. You can comment on the podcast Facebook page. You can send Jason or I a message if you know us. You could also email us at amazedandperplexed@gmail.com or reach out to us via our website, amazedandperplexed.com. Also, if you've benefited from these discussions, we would humbly ask that you consider sharing this podcast with someone you think would get something out of it. We want Amazed and Perplexed to be a blessing to as many people as possible. Grace, peace, and love.